So I'm going to present optimizing performance in Sitecore. Who am I? Yogesh Patel. I work as solutions architect at RightPoint in Boston office. I am Sitecore Technology MVP 2014 to 2018, and I am an author of Sitecore Cookbook for Developers. Um, so the agenda for today is we will see like how we can configure ASP.NET, Sitecore, SQL, IIS, and Azure to optimize the performance. So basically, the agenda is not to cover anything from front-end side, like reducing the number of requests, caching CSS and JS, minify and merging. So it is only backend steps related to Sitecore or related to infrastructure. First, we will see ASP.NET side, and that is precompiled views. So why precompiled views? Because once our views are precompiled, that will actually give boost up to the application startup, and that is recommended on Azure Web Apps, especially like in PaaS. The reason behind it is Azure PaaS will always have very low disk I/O, and that is the reason like it will take a lot of time in compiling all the view files if they are not precompiled, and the application startup will be really slow on Azure. So that is really recommended if your implementation is deployed on Azure. Even like if it is deployed on VMs or on-prem, but still precompiled views are really good option. There are many other benefits other than application startup. So number one is compile time view syntax checking. I remember like a couple of years ago, I did a mistake that there was we had to fix a bug ASAP, and I actually changed the view file and directly sent it for the deployment on the dev instance, and somehow it was throwing some compile time errors. So these kind of things can be fixed if the views are pre-compiled. Second is file dependency cache. So by default, the views are not compiled. So what will happen is whenever the views are compiled first time, .NET will actually store that compiled view file, I would say code file or assemblies in cache, and that cache will be a file dependency based cache. Why it is like that? Because the second time when you are changing uh, the view file again, then .NET will know that, hey, the view file is changed, so it will actually clear that file dependency cache, and it will compile the file again and and again the create the same cache again and again. And I have seen that that cache never gets cleared from the memory. So that is just appended on the application domain. So if the file is changed like 3-4 times, all the versions are stored in application domain. Another limitation is like the .NET applications. It has a limitation like it allows only 15 dynamic compilations, and after that it will recycle the app pool. So uh, I know like we can change that value as well, but still it's a limitation. So to overcome all those problems, I think the pre-compiled views are the best option. Um, from Sitecore 8.2, Sitecore added a native support to pre-compiled views. And before that, like we had to manually do all those compilations and change some .NET related configurations to achieve that. So let us see how we can achieve that on Sitecore. So number one step is install NuGet packages. So we will have to make sure like we add a razor generator.ms build that will be actually responsible to compile all the razor views. And another important thing is .NET compiler platform. That is nothing but the Roslyn compiler. So just make sure like we use the latest version of Roslyn to get the optimal performance. Second step is to register those views files or the assembly files for those views into Sitecore precompiled views. So if you see this configuration, what it does is it is a place where we can register all our assemblies where the view files are stored. So just for example, in my feature navigations feature project, all my view files will be compiled into um, the navigations project itself, so that I will have to just make sure like I add all those assemblies right here, so that Sitecore will know, hey, these are the assemblies Sitecore will have to get on the view files. Now, why it is important for Sitecore? It's because .NET knows that these files are actually compiled, but Sitecore does not know about them. So this is the way Sitecore will know that the view files are compiled, and it has to ask .NET to get the compiled view files from the assemblies. Now, one thing we will have to remember is we will have to add all the projects where the view files are, so that Sitecore will know. In case we forget to add any project here, then we will lose the benefit of precompiled views. Even though the view files are compiled, Sitecore will still go to the view files and it will ask .NET compiler to compile them. And another thing is like the only limitation of this approach, especially in local environment, is Sitecore will not consider on-the-fly changes on published view, because Sitecore knows that all those view files inside the assembly, those are pre-compiled. So Sitecore will never go to the physical file and ask .NET compiler to compile. Now, it looks like it's a limitation, but let us see. So initially, like when I implemented the pre-compilation, what we thought is like now we will have to build our project every time after every modification of the view file. Just consider one case, like I just deployed my application. Now within a couple of minutes, I found a bug and I need to make one line of code change. It doesn't make sense to deploy the whole project. So the answer is no. There is a provision inside core. There is a setting like mvc.use physical views if newer value is equal to true. By default, it is false. So what it will do is, by default, the Sitecore application will use pre-compiled view files. And whenever we change the view file on the fly in our website folder, Sitecore knows that, hey, the view file is changed. Now let's do not use the assemblies, I mean precompiled views, and let's compile it again. So we can use that in local environment. That is not recommended in production environment. And the reason I mentioned, like if we use it on production, and if someone is trying to, and if we are trying to use change the view files again and again, that will unnecessarily add compiled code base into the cache. Just me stop and ask questions if you have any. So I'm just continuing through the presentation. Uh, Now let's go to Sitecore part. The first is cache tuning. Of course, it is the most important and my favorite. So let us see what Sitecore caches have the sizes by default. These are the three most important caches which I believe. Prefetch cache, those that is mainly used on the application startup. So that basically generates a structure with the data of items, templates, and their hierarchies. Data items that actually stores the raw data of all the items which are cached, and items cache that actually stores the actual item object of the item. And the default size is Sitecore has provided is 200 meg, 150. Now, I have seen like some implementations, like even after 1 year of go live, they are still using those default values, and they have no idea like there is a way to tune those caches as well. So let us see, like if we go with these default values, how Sitecore will actually behave, and we will see with some example. So let us consider our server is having 8 gig of RAM, and the default cache values we are considering as above. So using that, we will only use 15 percentage of RAM for all these three caches, for all these three databases, 5% for master, 5% for web and core. So now 84%, 85%, they will be used by system resources or some other Sitecore resources as well. But most of the cache Sitecore uses will be data cache and items cache. And the same on CD instance, we will only use 10 percentage because there will be no master database. Now, most of the implementations I have seen, or I would say if there is any simple implementation, not without any um, complexity or not like having third-party services installed on Sitecore instances, uh, I generally go with 30% rule. So whatever RAM I am given, I will assign 30 percentage of my cache to master web and core databases. I know like there are many other caches inside core, but um, based on my experience, I always prefer these caches for data cache and items cache. So what I prefer is like assign 15 percentage of my memory to master database, and that is because most of the operations will happen on master. 10% on web. The reason behind it is a web database will mostly used for publishing and indexing, and we'll give the least amount of cache to core database. Again, those are not like thumb rule. Those sizes may vary based on the implementation, how we have implemented the functionalities or how the business rules are. And yeah, another thing is if it's a VM, and so for VM, of course, Windows needs its own Windows has its own resources like Windows services and other system resources. So we need to make sure like we also keep some space for Windows. And if we have some other instances as well, like Windows services or any other services, we also have to make sure like we give some space to them as well and do not overutilize the RAM. But yeah, if we are on Azure PaaS, then we can have some more freedom of occupying the space. And with the same stats on CD, what I would go with is 20% to the web database and 5% to the core database. If I have like extranet users, like I'm using security on CD instances or on my published site, maybe I will reduce it to 20% and 10% to core database. It depends like how my functionality is working and how the website is implemented. So these are the stats I collected from my recent implementation. So the reason behind preparing these stats is to get some idea like if I go with 100 MB like the default size, how many items it will be caching. So for prefetch cache, it will store 17,500 items for 100 MB of my cache size. For data cache, it will store 40,000 items. And for items cache for 50 MB, it will store 10,200. Now, as I mentioned in my previous slide that the most important caches are data cache and items cache, and I will give more sizes to the data cache. The reason behind that is how Sitecore architecture is implemented is just consider one example that one item in Sitecore has 5 languages and each language has 5 versions. So that means that item has 25 languages. Now, when you are reading one item, that item with English language and one version, Sitecore still reads all those 25 versions and it stores all 25 versions raw data into the data cache, even though you are reading only one version. Unlike data cache, item cache will only store the version you are reading and it will actually store the item object. So that's how I will give more. And I think Sitecore is also adding more space for the data cache. That is the reason. And if you are tuning items cache or data cache, just make sure like those are proportionally tuned. So if you make like 500 MB, just make sure like you set data set to the double.
Hey Yogesh,
Yep.
on CD environment, actually, we have disabled this Sitecore cell and that admin part. So how we can actually view these caches and these kind of statistics?
That is a great thing. So I can show you. Okay, so if you have enabled, let me go to. So I have seen like some people will actually enable it for temporarily for seeing that, or other option is you can go to app data and go to diagnostics and go to health monitor. and you can see it right here. So basically what Sitecore does is every 10 minutes, it is actually storing all the caches here. It is the same thing which you can see in this page. So basically this page is stored to that folder every 10 minutes. So
Okay,
that's
great,
how, yeah,
great.
that,
Thank you.
yep.
So is it similar with that configuration also? Do we have here?
For configuring these caches,
No, like overall compiled configuration file. We see that show config.aspx. So that is also here stored somewhere or not?
are you talking about the pre-compiled views?
No, no, that show config.aspx, right?
I got it. Oh, I got it what you are saying. So you want to see the show config as well.
Correct. Yeah.
I got it. So there are two ways of doing that. Like if you have the production configurations files, and you can do it on your local as well using the same tool. So that's how you can also see the show configurations. Mostly, like what I have done is I always yeah, that's a good point for show config on CD environment. But mostly I have used all the admin tools, and Sitecore has now added all the logs to see all the tool related information.
Yogesh, wouldn't it work like, if you just disable the anonymous access on all other non-required file, but just enable it on the show config? That should still able to show you on
Yeah,
the CD side.
absolutely. Yep, that's what I said. Like, so what some people does is they temporarily allow access of admin, like for the admin users, and they will restrict that access for some IP addresses, something like that. So there is still a
Yeah.
way to do that. But yeah, like if there is no way for checking the caches, yeah, Sitecore has a way to do that, and Sitecore also has performance routers and other configurations as well. So you do not need to use admin folder. But yeah, for show config, the direct option is to either enable it, disable the restrictions and see directly there, or you can do it in your local using a SIEM tool.
Actually, on our production environment, we cannot disable that access. We don't have that access. But yeah, we need to look for some
Yeah,
other
got it. So
alternate.
yeah, so what I did in past is like I have all the configurations for my CD instance, and I will collect them. I will add it to one local folder where Sitecore configurations are, and I will use SIEM tool to generate the view configuration. I mean show configuration.
There's
Unless
also
anyone.
there's a tool, I think it's called like Config Builder or something that I've used in the past. The name escapes me off the top of my head, but it's like an exe that you can download. I think it's on GitHub or something, and you just point at like your app config folder, and it'll just build up what your show config would look like. So you can
Yeah,
just
I
drop
think
that on your server.
yeah, I think SIEM also does. Okay, I got it. So you will drop it on the server, that tool.
Yeah, or like if you have access to the server, copy your configs locally, and then you can use that. But
Yep,
it gets
SIEM also does
further.
the same thing. So SIEM will also do the same thing. Like we have to just make sure like all the configurations are in your local and the instance is up and running, and then you can run the same tool and it will allow you to generate your show configuration file. I have used it a couple of times, but again, it was only for my local purpose. But yeah, that should work too. Um, So we discussed about three caches. The fourth one is access result cache. I will discuss a little bit more about that in next slide. But basically, all those are really important caches inside core. Like there are, again, like there are many, maybe 90, 70, or 100 types of caches, but those are useful, but these are the most important ones. And the final one is HTML cache. That is like website level. If you have multiple sites that are in multi-site environment, each site can have a different HTML cache. So you will have to make sure like you tune it based on the site, not just a generic 25 MB. And all other are like instance specific caches. Okay.
Yogesh, quick question. Is there a way where you can, like, let's say if you are multi-sites, right? Can you configure this individually per site?
So for all these 5 or 6, No, you cannot. But yeah, for HTML cache, definitely you can configure it cache level. So if you want to see like which caches you can configure site level, what generally I do is I can directly go to app config folder and open sitecore.configuration where I will search for HTML. Yep. So it allows us to configure these caches per site, and all other
Got it.
caches, those will be instance specific.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool. Thank you.
Um, this is like the I have seen like many implementations are struggling because of access result cache, whether you have used yeah security for your CDs or you have not used. So let us see like what experiences we had on using access result cache. So basically what it is that cache is used whenever a user is trying to access some content. And what Sitecore does, it actually stores the user and the accessible items in some cache list, and that happens for all the users who are actually trying to access it. So on CM instance, yes, it should be enabled. And on CD instance, it should be enabled only when the public site is using Sitecore security. When it should be disabled, when we are not using Sitecore security on public site, of course we can disable it. So I remember like in Sitecore 6 days, there was no way to disable it. So what we actually tried is we set the access result cache size to 0, and actually it didn't disable. It actually made the performance worst. The reason behind it was the access result cache is still enabled. Now it is trying to add and delete all the caches because the size is 0. So it actually decreased the performance, and we got a patch from Sitecore to disable that. But luckily, recent versions of Sitecore, we can disable that. And this is how we can disable, like go to the web database and you can disable it using security enabled equal to false. So if you are not using the security on web, you can also disable that on CM to get improved performance. The limitation of disabling on CM is your content authors now also can see or access the web content, but that should be fine, like to optimize the performance. One implementation we had, like there were thousands of extranet users, and what happened is we went with 25. I don't remember like what was the default size, maybe let's say like 25 MB. So we went with 25 MB, and what was happening is Sitecore was clearing the access result cache every minute or two. So what happened is like one user is of course like accessing to 4 or 5 pages a minute. So like every minute their access cache was getting cleared. In fact, all users. So Sitecore was keeping itself busy just in creating and clearing the access result cache. So we doubled it, then we tripled it, and then I think we did like 10 times. I have no idea right now, but I remember like it was more than 5 times or 10 times that we set. And after that, like we got very good performance there. So that's how like we derived is larger size cache is equal to less cache clearing. That will give you more performance. But again, like if you are not using security, just do not try to tune the size, just disable the access result cache. Don'ts, I never faced this, but I remember like one of the community member was talking about this thing. So what they faced is they had actually used drop link field, and they used data queries there, Sitecore item queries there to get the data sources. So what happened, like the data sources was actually fetching hundreds of items. And because like there are hundreds of items, Sitecore was again keeping itself busy in checking the performance, checking the access for that users, and it become very slower to respond for those components. So the thing is like avoid all querying for uncertain number of items. If you know like how many items you are querying, then we are fine. You can go with that. Otherwise, just try to avoid all those things. I remember like in Sitecore 9.3, Sitecore has introduced permissions. Like you can query on Solr to check the permissions. So in previous days, what we had to do is let's collect the required documents from Solar, like let's say 100, and now we are checking security using Sitecore APIs. So that will add access result cache into the permission, and that will actually slow down the instance. But now, because in 9.3, there is no, um, there is permissions out of the box in Solar, so you can directly query on Solar to get the permissions and access for the documents. So that should actually limit the usage of access result cache. I have not personally used it, but based on what I am reading on 9.3, that is really, really helpful. So cache key indexing, I remember like when we were struggling with access result cache, so Sitecore recommended us to index the cache keys. So that is available for access result cache, item paths cache, and paths cache, because those caches are really slow to find out in the collection. So what Sitecore does is it basically creates an index for all the cache keys and their values so that it can find the keys really easily. Uh, so that is really helpful when we have a large number of items or versions or languages, and that really helpful in improving performance when the partial cache clearing happens. So let me tell you what is partial cache clearing. So whenever we publish, Sitecore may do item creation, deletion, it will move or rename the items. So basically it will have to remap the existing items on the collection, I mean on the cache, whether you delete or move or rename. So that is really lengthy operation, because if you are adding a new item, Sitecore just have to add it there, right there. But for copy, move, delete, and rename operations, it will have to find the ID, then it will have to change the data there, right there. So that's why like Sitecore implemented cache key indexing, so that on copy, move, delete operations, that will be super fast. The limitation of that is when actually the cache key is created, it will be slower than there is no cache key. But in return, um, the partial cache clearing is super fast compared to there is no cache key. So I would recommend using those configurations, especially when you have like larger number of items. In recent implementations, we used the item cache configuration, and what we found is Sitecore actually was able to publish the data. We can see the data in the database, but we could not see the cache were getting cleared. So we actually reverted that back, but that may not be case in all the versions. So I recommend like whenever you use these configurations, just make sure like you test them thoroughly and then move it to production. I remember like I used access result cache in my past, and that really boosted our performance. So yeah, I recommend using these configurations. Next,
But it's valid for 9.3 only or 8.2 as well.
I remember like that is from 7. I used it on Sitecore 6, so I'm sure like all those should be in Sitecore 8 as well. And I used them in Sitecore 9.02 as well.
Okay.
Utilize HTML caching. So that is again a fun part using HTML caching, because that will really boost the performance of the application. I know like most of the people will be aware of that, but the intention of adding it here, because there are specific cases we should add them. There are few cases where we should not use HTML caching. So that is the reason I am adding this topic here. So when should we add it? Like when there is any component which is reading multiple items and calculating the output. So that's where we should use HTML caching. The classic example is header and footer, because header and footer reads like always read the same items, maybe sometimes different based on the context, but most of the cases they will use the same items, and it doesn't make sense to calculate and it's the same read the same items again and again to generate the output. So definitely we can go with header and footer. Now I remember like in my previous implementations, we were actually showing a welcome message to the user, so a personalized message in the header, like welcome back Yogesh. But now does that mean should we use vary by user here? So vary by user means now we will create user specific header and footer caches. So now if we do that, like all the caches will be occupied by just header and footer, and it will not give chance to other components. So definitely it's not a recommended approach. In case we have a heavy footer and we still want to use caching, then we can do ajax calls as well just to show the username there. But I strongly recommend not to use vary by user. The mostly I prefer going with is cacheable with index update, vary by data, um, vary by login, like it's an anonymous user or a pseudonymous user. So mostly I go with them, but I would never recommend going with vary by user unless it's a specific need that we want to go with. Uh, Again, like we mentioned that tune HTML cache size is based on the usage, and that will be per site specific. And the health monitor, the logs I showed, that will really help. I remember like in our previous implementation, when there was no health monitor, what we did is we created a job, and that will run every 5 minutes. It will collect all the caches, and we will prepare a chart along with the CPU usage, along with memory usage, response times, and number of requests. So we prepared a chart, and based on that, we will actually figure it out what should be the tuned cache sizes. I know like it's very like 5 6 years ago maybe, but yeah, that's what we used, and still it is valid. Like those kind of charts can be really useful. On the multi-site or multi-tenant environment, sometimes like we keep forgetting to add the different sites on the publish and remote. So basically why it is required is whenever we publish, Sitecore does not know like which site that item is related to. So we specifically have to ask Sitecore to clear caches for all those websites here. So just make sure like whenever we add a new site, we add them one by one here. But that is like for all the implementations before 9.2. From 9.3, Sitecore has implemented Sitecore Smart HTML Cache Clearer. So what it does is it knows what sites are. So basically, it will iterate all the sites itself, and we do not need to worry about listing all those websites. In my previous multi-tenant environment, like we hosted like hundreds of websites for different clients. So what strategy we implemented is, now it doesn't make sense like if site A is publishing something, we should not clear cache of site B. So what we actually did is we override the HTML cache clearer, and what we did is we cleared the cache is site specific. So if you are publishing a item of site A, just make sure like you are only clearing site A cache, and still it is valid for a multi-site for a single client, single implementation. How it is valid is if we are publishing site A's item, we know like it is site A. But if we are publishing a global item, which can be of any site, then we just have to make sure like we cache clear like all the sites, something like that. Um, the only limitation of that site specific approach is related items, because the concept I'm talking about that will work only on the root item user is publishing. And if we enable referenced items, like we will never know like how many items are published. So it's up to like a business, like what they want to achieve. If they want to achieve site specific cache clearing, we can simply disable the referenced items, and there you go, we can achieve site specific cache clearing as well. Worst things to do on HTML caching. So that is, do not cache components. Those actually renders output from context item. The classic example is HTML body. Let's say an example, like if I am requesting a news page, now that news page will be, of course, my context item, and Sitecore already has cached that item. Then why should I cache it twice in my HTML cache? So that is unnecessary redundancy. It will unnecessarily occupy my memory. rather I would actually use it for some other caches. So that's important thing to note down. And yeah, of course, vary by user. So just remember like to not overuse it for personalized content. Uh, Another interesting thing for troubleshooting the performance, or like it can be used for multiple reasons, like cache page. I think I showed that like we can see all the caches here and we can prepare a chart like based on what caches are stored based on the time. Rendering statistics is really interesting tool Sitecore has provided. Let me quickly show that. So let me, so if whenever you want to open admin pages, just go to Sitecore/admin and go to rendering statistics. So what it provides it provides all the renderings created in Sitecore, and it also provides the statistics like which rendering is executed how many times. Is it rendered from the cache? What is the average time it takes to render particular component? What is the average items it is reading? What was the maximum time, maximum items? So basically that is really useful to decide the caching strategy. So let's consider one example is sample layout. I know it's a Sitecore out of the box. It is right now taking like 1500 milliseconds and it is reading around 61 items. So 61 items is too much. I think I should go ahead and cache this sub layout. So what I am doing right now is I am going to sample sub layout and caching it. I am not playing with any other caching options. I am simply caching this item. And let me open a new tab. I am resetting all the caches, and I am visiting this page. 1, 2, 3, 4. I think that should be enough. Let me see the statistics now. Wow, it is not reading from the cache. I was in debug mode. That may be the reason, because it needs a live mode for using the caches. Okay, let us see now. Awesome. So if you see now, it is reading from the cache. So let me do one thing. Let me reset the stats and again refresh the page. And now, so I requested this component 4 times, and every time it was rendered from the cache. And the average time now you see is 0.01 milliseconds only, compared to like 1500 milliseconds. So that's how like we can improve the performance. This was a really simple component that is reading like 1500 items. And just remember, like it is not like 61 items. So how Sitecore decides 61 items, that is like it checks the children as well, it checks the templates, their fields. So it is not only the content item you are reading, it also reads a lot many other items as well, like rendering item as well, rendering parameters as well. So just make sure like you find a maximum number of items and cache them accordingly. Jobs, that is another cool tool. I think everyone knows about that. Like that is really useful to know like which jobs are running, so that we can know like, hey, what's happening, and we can take actions accordingly. Another cool feature Sitecore has provided is pipeline profiler. So what it does is basically it generates a snapshot of different pipelines and their processors, how much time they are taking, how much time the CPU is, how much CPU they are consuming. They can take the snapshot of all those values. So let me show that tool. So basically like it will list down all the pipelines and all the processors. Now, if you have an idea like what those pipelines are and what the processors are, so you can definitely go ahead and see the performance. Right now, I have a vanilla Sitecore installation, but I remember like you can, if you have custom implementation, definitely you can go ahead and see the performance they are having. So let's say HTTP request begin pipeline. So it will list down all the processors and it will say, hey, this is number one, this is the slowest one, this is second one. So it will give you all these parameters here. The last is not an admin tool, but it's a debug mode. So why debug mode is really useful is it tells you like how many items it is reading, where which component is taking how much time for the page level. And the same thing I think which showed checked in rendering statistics, but that is like in general average. But the debug mode will actually give you the actual time it is taking on page level, on component level. So how we can go ahead is, let me open it in Experience Editor. And what there are some other options as well in the debug mode, like one is tracing. So I'm sure like most of the people use logs for all those information, like info logs, for warning logs, for error logs. So I also use logs a lot, but sometimes like uh, it makes sense to use the tracing for the logging purpose. Let me show like how it will work. Uh, so I am going into debug mode. So now most time taken. So mostly the time is taken in some lengthy operations. That is my custom tracing. So that is not a good option, good example, but like resolving device, it took this many milliseconds, and it shows all the profiling information and tracing information. So you can check your components as well. So the tracing I'm talking about, let me show you one example that is really, really useful when we want to see the errors or warnings or information without going to the log file. So this is the sample sublayout file, which is called on the page. So I know like by default, it was just this code, but I have added this tracing information. So what I have done is sitecore.diagnostic.profiler.start operation, some lengthy operation. So when my component is doing some lengthy operation, like it is doing SSO handshake, or it is doing like external data import, or it is using external, whatever external integration, or making some Solr queries or SQL queries. So I will surely write it down like I'm starting this operation. Just for safer side, I have added a threading here. Now I am doing some lengthy operations. In my case, I am simply using get descendants to just delay the task. And then I am ending the operation. So what Sitecore does internally is it might be using some stopwatch kind of mechanism to remember like how much time this total operation took. And it will actually show us in the debug mode. The other thing we can use is sitecode.diagnostic.tracer.info. So we can add like info, warning, error. So mostly I used it. I remember like how much time it took to connect to the external entity, how much time it took to fetch the results, how much time it took to sort the results, something like that. So that's how we can add the logs here. Sometimes like warning logs as well. Hey, this kind of issues happened. The reason is like content authors do not know like what happened in the background, but at least they can know what happened on the front end itself without asking developers to go to the log files. So with this simple implementation, let us see how it will show in the log in the debug mode. So some lengthy operation that took almost 1500 milliseconds. So that's how we will know about that. Then we can also show the info log, warning log, error log right here. And Sitecore will do that only when we are on debug mode, so that we are in normal mode or editing mode. It makes sure like we do not overkill Sitecore with this tracing information. So we can definitely go with this approach if we have such kind of implementation or a need. Um, Another important thing is publishing. I have seen like many cases like the publishing, the performance of the website is sometimes correlated with publishing and caching, both the things. So why? It's because publishing is costlier operation. Number two is after each publish, Sitecore clears the HTML cache. Like building HTML cache that takes minutes or maybe hours to generate all the caches there, and clearing just takes a second. One single publish, everything is gone. So the recommendation is avoid frequent publishing. So what we can use instead is publish items in a group, like try to use sub items, try to use related items. Again, this is not for all the implementations. This is only for those implementations where we are struggling performance, where we are getting cache clear very frequently. So on those kind of implementations, what we can do is we can schedule the publish. There are multiple ways of scheduling. Number one is we can use the item level scheduled publish, and what we can do along with that is there is a publish agent in Sitecore. So you can find it out on sitecore.configuration file. So basically like just go ahead and change the interval to one hour, and by default it will be a incremental publish, and you can add the languages as well. So every 1 hour what it will do is it will basically find out all the modified items, and it will publish from master to web with the given number of items. So if we are going with this approach, it is strongly recommended we go with incremental. Otherwise, like using smart or republish, we will end up like having a long queue of publishing. Again, like for larger Sitecore implementations, it is recommended like we disable database caches. So what does that mean is, let's consider one example is content author has created 50 items. Now he is actually trying to publish all those 50 items. So what will happen is Sitecore will actually cache all those 50 items from master as well as on the web because it is publishing them. And that is unnecessarily creating cache for those unnecessary items, right? So Sitecore has provided this setting that it will disable database caches only while the publishing and only when the publishing is incremental publish. So that's how like it will go away in occupying unnecessary database caches. Publishing scalability. So number one is parallel publishing.
Hey Yogesh, one more
Yep.
question. Uh, till 8.2 it was not there, but I'm not sure if it is in Sitecore 9 and onwards. This if this is something that scheduled kind of, it's not scheduled, but it's a job running every 1 hour or every at a fixed interval of time, right? But is there a feature to schedule publish at a specific time?
So there is no such feature available, but there are plenty of options you can choose. So one option is you can use web jobs. So that is one way, or there are some other modules also available. I also implemented a scheduled publish. So what we did is we actually created a custom database, and so we added all the scheduled items there with the timings, and we had a scheduled Windows task that will run every 5 minutes, and that will actually start the publishing, something like that. But if you want to invoke, there is no way you can do that, of course, like because it's a web application. So you will have to either wait for you will have to create another thread to do those implementation, right? So for now there are two ways, like one is item level, you can decide when the item should be published, and this configuration will actually take care for that publishing. So that's how out of the box Sitecore publishing works. I remember
So
like
that web job you said, is that marketplace tool or what is it?
Not actually. So I was talking about in context of Azure. So what we can do is like on Azure in your web app, you can have web jobs. Those are part of the subscription. So where we can create web jobs that will actually run every 5 minutes, something like that. And that will do the same operations which we are doing it here every 1 hour, something like that. Even you can also run it every 5 minutes. So
Mhm.
that is also an option, because if we go with incremental, it is not traversing the whole tree. Basically, it is just going to those items which are modified, right?
Okay, yeah.
For lightweight Sitecore instances, it is we can use like the maximum degree of parallelism. That is like you can by default it is one, but we can have like two or three or whatever number of threads we want to go with. So what it will do is it will create multiple threads for the publishing. So the benefit is like it will make the publishing faster, but the limitations is it may occupy more CPU and maybe sometimes more memory as well, depends on the implementations we have. And sometimes it may do SQL deadlock based on what thread is doing what, but there are still a chances of having that. So that is not like I would not recommend doing it on all the instances, but of course lightweight instances and having good CPU, we can definitely try that. Another one is publishing instance. I know like it's now out of outdated thing, but Sitecore uh, actually implemented this thing when there was no parallel publishing or no publishing service. So what it did actually, um, it will have like two replicas of CMs. One will actually work as a CM and second will work as a publishing instance. So whenever we do publish from CM, the publishing will actually happen from the second instance. So that's how Sitecore managed it internally. Something like we have right now roles, like who will do reporting or processing, something like that. But this is still valued currently, and there is no role for publishing instance, but instead we can have a configuration like this and just add a publishing instance name here in the configuration. The limitation of that is, of course, infrastructure cost and license cost. So I'm sure like no one will try to go with this option unless the CM itself is scaled and someone want to use publish only from one instance, then this is a good option. And the third option is, of course, publishing service. That is the fastest one, and the limitation is it will need some additional infrastructure cost. And this is the best way, like if we have a larger implementation, the main limitation of that is it may not allow us to do a lot of customizations like the way we can do it on the regular publishing. It may not allow us to do that. Next is like indexing optimization. So why this is important is because there are multiple reasons like indexing optimization is essential. I have faced couple of times like because of some bugs on our side or due to some infrastructure problems, like we need to rebuild the index, and sometimes it may take a lot of time, and that also affects the performance of the website because indexing itself is a costlier operation and it can affect performance of CM instance as well. So the idea is index only what you query. So what Sitecore does out of the box is it index all the fields. Then the configuration I'm showing, those are for the optimization, but I'm talking about the default Sitecore configurations. So by default, it indexes all the fields. Instead of having add include template and add include field, it configures add excluded templates and add excluded fields. So what it does is by default is Sitecore is allowing us to index everything what we create. So Sitecore has a configuration like that. It will skip indexing for its own templates and fields, but it will allow all our custom templates and fields to be indexed. Now for a larger implementation, this is not a recommended practice. What we can do is just opposite what Sitecore does. So we should index all fields to false. We do not need to index anything which is out of the box. What we can do instead is add included templates, means we will include only those templates we want to query on, and same thing on the fields as well. So that's one thing. And Sitecore also has a configuration like check template inheritance to true. So how that is useful is, just for example, we use Helix principles. So we have our foundation template like base page. So if we have added base page here, we do not need to add like news, event, and all other pages there. Base page will take care for the inherited templates as well. And once we do that, like we prepared some stats as well based on our recent implementation. I can show you that as well, like how beneficial it will be. Another optimization thing is, like we did it for template level, we did it for field level. Now it is also important to do it on Sitecore node level. If we are on CM for master instance, we must index from Sitecore node itself, because Sitecore internally uses systems or templates or any nodes which we may not know, like for buckets, for general content search. So we kept Sitecore as is for the master database, but for web database, what we did is, because we are only um, querying the content pages, so we only uh, set root as content page. And if we have any other images or any other files, we can add that as well as a second root. So the idea is not to index templates, system layouts, all other nodes. And yeah, it is also important that we do not index the images, because images will not have any metadata that is useful for content search. We can also disable the database caches whenever the indexing is happening. It is the same way we did it for publishing. So how this will be helpful is, like whenever the indexing is happening, um, Sitecore will make sure like it does not cache all those items while indexing. So that will actually significantly reduce the usage of caches at the time of indexing. Switch on rebuild index. So as I mentioned, like sometimes.
Hey, quickly, what you said earlier, this images by default are indexed or no?
By default, it has like Sitecore node. So it will index everything inside the Sitecore node.
Okay.
Yeah, what Sitecore does is, like there are some options, like you can index the files and you can crawl their content as well, but that's a separate thing. Um, Next option is like switch on rebuild index. As I mentioned, like in the previous slide, like sometimes we need to rebuild index, maybe because of business logic changes, or because of so many any other unwanted problems we are facing. So whenever we do rebuild index, there will be surely downtime, because Sitecore, what Solar will do is it will clear the index and it will actually start rebuilding. So it will stop showing the content on the website. Those are actually fetched from Solar. So what we can do is we can use this option available in Sitecore. So what it does basically is we will have to create two cores. By default, Sitecore will be using the primary one, and secondary will be sitting idle. Whenever we do rebuild index, Sitecore will actually uh, ask Solar to reindex on the second one. And once it is reindexed, Sitecore will actually swap the cores. And the same thing also available on Solar Cloud. Um, that is actually used using the aliases, but the concept is basically the same thing. These are the stats I was talking about. So when we did not do any optimization, there were around 310,000 of items. After optimization went down to 80,000, 300 fields to 200. Master database indexing time was 12 minutes. It went down to 10 minutes. Web indexing time was 10 minutes. That went down to 2 minutes. This is again approximate, not approximate, the average we took for multiple iterations of indexing. And yeah, that's what benefit we got in indexing optimization. So now it's part of optimizing the content search queries. So if you know like SQL, like you whenever you make a query from Visual Studio, SQL Management Studio, like by default it show fetches only 1,000 records. Similarly, when you are make a query on Solar, it fetches only 10 items or 10 documents. But what Sitecore does is in Sitecore 9, it fetches 1 million records. So if your query is having these many documents, Solar will actually return you back those many documents, even though you do not need them. In previous versions, like those, that number was even bigger. I think it was the maximum value of the integer. I know like not all the implementations will face this problem while reading it, but in cases like when we have hundreds or thousands of items returned from Solar, of course, it may affect performance, especially when we have not used Sitecore recommended practices. So one thing we can do is what we can do, like we can limit this 1 million to maybe 1,000 or 100, because I do not think like practically any site will be using like those many listing with some exceptions. Like paginations, it's still fine because paginations will only need 10, 20 or 30 pages, and we can actually paginate using these two operations here. So recommended thing is like we changed it value in Solar configuration file. I mean, inside core Solar configuration file. Second option is like we can also use take link you expression, so that we will only, even though like Solar returns. So using this expression, we can ask Solar to only return us the given number of documents instead of like fetching everything. And the most important thing, we will have to make sure like we use take expression before the get item. Otherwise, what will happen is we get hundreds of documents. Those will be converted to the get item. And now we are taking top 3 or 5 items we need. So just take an opposite, use take first and then get item. So whenever, now let's see how we can optimize content migration, import, or synchronization. Um, like I have done like many migrations or product synchronization or content synchronizations. So what happens like in older days, like there was no indexing out of the box, so Sitecore was super faster. But in recent days, Sitecore has added many events along with like indexing or any other events there. Plus, whenever we create item or we update item, it checks the security whether the context user has access for creation or not. It will create event queue events for remote events as well as its own events for indexing events as well. And indexing is the most costliest operation whenever we do item save or any modifications to the item. And it will also create the database caches whenever we are creating an item. So the best approach is while doing import or content migration is we use all those bulk update context, security disabler, event disabler, and database cache disabler to get the optimal performance. The only limitation of doing this is um, we will have to reindex the folder where we are creating or updating the items, and sometimes we also need to clear the cache if the cache is um, not generated on remote servers if we have. And the benefit of this is like it will only disable all those features only inside the block I am showing on the right hand side. So this will not affect any other indexing going on or security checks going on. And the most important thing is whenever we are doing content migration or this kind of activities, just do not try to use web pages or use a Sitecore ribbon command there, right there, without using Sitecore job. So why it is like that? Because if you use a web page or if you use a command button on Sitecore ribbon without using a Sitecore job, it will actually, it is not actually thread safe, so that it will actually block your whole UI if the process is going longer. And it will also have a request timeout. So which whatever is configured in the web config. So there are many limitations of having a page using page for content migration. Rather, I would recommend Sitecore recommends is using Sitecore job, so that we can track the progress, we can see the status as well, and of course it is thread safe, so that it will not affect any UI, even though you invoke it from the content editor ribbon button, just like publishing. So it is totally thread safe, and it can go for longer period as well. All miscellaneous improvement tactics are like, those are very general tactics, like allow limited number of item versions, recommended is 10 or less. Allowed number of children inside one node should be limited, like around 10 or less. So what we can do is, I know like it's very standard practice nowadays, but what we can do is, like if it is necessary, that we can customize the pipeline for item creation or version creation, and we can show a dialog that, hey, you are reaching the recommended versions 10, something like that, or similarly for the number of items as well. And so admin also can know that, and they can decide the strategy, what to be implemented there, something like that. We can also create scheduled tasks to remove all unnecessary older versions. That is also good options. Like I have implemented it a couple of times, and that is really helpful to content authors. Disable performance counters. So by default, those are true in Sitecore. So whenever we are deploying to production, just make sure like those are disabled. That is like that, otherwise it will unnecessarily log all the performance counters which are set by default there. Avoid polluting log files. Sometimes, like when I started working on Sidecore, I just tell you my story is, I was logging everything, whatever I was doing there, and that was unnecessarily increasing the CPU space there, CPU usage there, and disk IO as well. So just add logs only when those are necessary, just to not over entry there. And as I mentioned, like create Sidecore jobs for lengthy operations. Another option is optimize size and resolution of the images upon upload, or even if you can optimize them at the time of rendering as well. Like example is Dianoga tool. So that will actually optimize all the images on runtime. I think that's it from my Sitecore side configurations. Now let us see all infrastructure side and Azure. So SQL, I think like everyone must be aware of this screen is like Windows disk fragmentation. Like this is like in Windows XP or 2000 days, where the disk space were actually fragmented, and that were actually slowing down the performance of Windows for startup, overall performance as well, and we had to defragmentation. So the same thing actually happens inside core database as well, especially like we have continuously items additions, deletions, or updations going on. So, and especially on reporting database, because it will be fragmented so quickly. So the ideal thing is we do defragmentation the indexes very regularly. Maybe SQL admins can help with that, or we can also find out those indexes to be defragmented. So this is one example I have took is on left hand side. Those are the indexes. Those are fragmented like 98%, 90%, like 30%. And once we do index them, rebuild index them, and after that it is totally gone. So everything is defragmented. What Sitecore recommend is whenever average fragmentation is 30% or above, just make sure like we do defragmentation. If you are using SQL Azure, then Azure also recommends us like which indexes should be created and why those should be created, which indexes should be deleted, or which queries are needs to be optimized. So just make sure like we also go to the SQL Azure and see the recommendations, what it is doing. And another thing in SQL is like if we are using Azure SQL, and the by default how Sitecore generates the databases are they generate databases per slot. So that is actually more, there is actually costlier option. So we can also go with Azure Elastic pools so that we can add those databases into one pool to get the most benefit of the Elastic pools there. There is another option, but it is not like you will get a benefit of performance, but that is really good important thing to know. Zero downtime deployments. So basically, the reason for adding this is now, like just for example, if we have like ping kind of tools available, like which will see the downtime of your application. So if we deploy something, if we deploy to our production environment, surely the CD or maybe CM will be down for a time. And this topic is to prevent all those things. I know like we can deploy it through the load balancer for the CD instances, but that is not again like the 100% uh, best approach to go with. So especially like we are going with Azure, like we can utilize some other advantages in Azure as well. So first is like application initialization warm-up. So what it does is it's basically IIS module we can install, and what it does is as soon as the application is recycled, it will actually do a cold start. So it will actually start, it will ask Sitecore to come up and it will start warming up the environment. So the benefit of using that is whenever site is not ready to be served, we can redirect the users to some other URLs as well, or even we can also rewrite the request to show something else. So that's how like we can give a really good experience to the end users. This is really cool module to use in local environment, because like whenever we build our application and deploy, the building and deploy may take a couple of minutes, and application startup may also take few seconds or maybe a couple of minutes. And this will make sure like as soon as the application is built and deployed, it will immediately start warming up Sitecore. So that will save some time. This module only supports HTTP. It does not support HTTPS. So we can still use this module with HTTPS with some tricks using the URL rewrite. And it may not work with ARR. So mostly like no one will be using ARR on the Sitecore instances. So we are good there. But this is a really cool feature if you want to minimize the application startup. Now, like whenever we do deploy, first thing we do on CM is we do login as an admin. We open content editor, we open experience editor, we do some general search. The reason behind doing that is to warm up Sitecore instance, and of course that will surely take some time. And once everything is working, then we say, hey, deployment is done. And so instead of doing all those things manually, what we can do is we can use warm up script that can do everything for us. So what that warm-up script is, I have like one link end of this presentation. So I have defined all those configurations actually from this presentation. And I have also added the warm-up script there. I took it from one of the community member. I think I cannot see the slide there, but I have all the scripts mentioned there. So basically what we do is whenever the deployment is done, the last step in this deployment is to run the PowerShell script, and that will actually do login on the identity server or the CM server, and then it will open the Sitecore dashboard. It will open content editor, experience editor. It will do some bucket search. So basically, it will do the same thing which we do normally to warm up Sitecore instance, and that will actually help us to minimize downtime. And the most important thing for CD instances is deployment slots if we are using Azure. So what deployment slots are, those are actually a feature of web app. So basically your web app service can have multiple slots, or I would say multiple app instances. So let's say this is an example. The webs, so here you can see like web app production slot and web app staging slot. So what it will do is by default, the production slot will be serving content to the end user, and staging slot will be sitting idle. Now, whenever we do deploy, we by default we do deploy from source control to staging slot, and meanwhile, the production slot will be unaffected. Now, once the deployment is done, we can see the deployment is successful or not. We can even test it as well. We can do alpha testing. Once everything is done, then we can change the slots. And once we change the slots, what will happen is the staging slot will become the production and production will become staging. So now, without any downtime, the application will be up and running with the new release. And we can keep this staging slot as a backup to see what was there in the previous release. So that's how like we can achieve a zero downtime deployments. There are many benefits of this. This is like blue-green deployment. We can do A/B testing as well. We can do alpha and beta testing. In case of doing rollback deployment, we again have to switch those slats back. The only limitation is if you want to use it for rollback deployment, you also have to make sure like you do synchronize your databases along with these slots. So you will have two databases, one is for production and one is for staging. So that's how we can achieve blue-green deployment with zero downtime for deployments. That's it. Any questions? Or maybe we can discuss about any topic like.
Hey, that was a great presentation. I've got a couple comments that maybe we can talk about. One thing to mention, you talked about tuning solar indexes. That is a huge part of performance. I found the same thing. But I wanted to just note that one of the best things that you can do is define your own custom index instead of modifying the Sitecore web one out of the box. That's usually a great way to leave the Sitecore defaults the way they are. And then when you do searches, on your websites, you can actually define, a specific instance to have just the things that you want to have. The other reason why that's important is that if you ever switch over to the web database, say using desktop mode in Sitecore, it's actually the web index that gets searched, from the site search features on desktop. So if you've stripped it down to only include certain templates, that's all you'll find in web desktop mode. So it's often safer to define your own index. So,
Yep, that's really good point. Yep.
Yeah. The other comment I had, this was a little bit later on when you were talking about elastic pools. I don't know if you've had experience with this, but we've had some issues with putting all of the Sitecore databases in the same pool. One of the things that can happen is that, particularly during publishing operations, the web and master databases can steal resources from each other. So sometimes you might want to have the web database in a different elastic pool than your master and core databases. Have you had experience with that, or have you encountered that same issue?
Yes, that is correct. So it is not only with the web database and master databases, like if you have like tons of user requests, it can also happen with the reporting database, or I would say XConnect related databases. So what generally we do is, we first start with one elastic pool. When we face the DT usage is increasing on master or on web, what we can do is just make a web separate from all of, as a separate pool. And now the third step is if we are having the same problems again on the original pool, like XConnect related databases, then we again have to make a separate pool for XConnect. I know like it's a costly operations, but if we want to get the performance, yeah, that's the only operation we can go with. But yeah, that is true. Like I have seen like by default, master and web both are consuming more resources on publishing.
I would just correct one thing. My recommendation would be not to create a separate elastic pool for just web database. You can just have it as a separate database with higher DTUs. That will give you the most bang for bucks, because the database would scale on its own, and it doesn't need to be in elastic pool if it's just single database.
Good point.
Yeah, that's a good point. Or other option is like we can also move analytics databases, I mean to say external databases with the web database. But yeah, that's a good point. We should not have a single database on one Elastic pool.
Yeah, and with XConnect as well, sometimes what we can do is if you're like within XConnect, like as Yogesh mentioned, we have done it like like we create like a separate Elastic pool. But even from the that Elastic pool of XDB databases, you can just separate out reporting databases and just keep like the shard 0 and shard 1 into one. That can also help you from the Elastic pool, because shard 1 is basically, and 0 is the replacement of MongoDBs. So those are generally the higher performance one. And just to save some cost, the other databases could be on lower DTUs with higher specs or higher like GBs, because data storage is cheaper versus the DTUs.
Yep, that's a good point.
Also, to that point, sometimes the clients do not utilize the analytics database that much, even though they have analytics enabled. So we could utilize the marketplace tools such as ADM tool, which would be deleting your old data. You can set a certain date, and from that point on, you can remove the old data and keep the data for at least a year or year and a half, depending on how active your client is for the analytics usage.
Which tool it is? ADN?
ADM, Analytics Database Manager
Okay,
tool. Yeah.
got it. So it's a Sitecore tool, or it's a marketplace module?
Marketplace.
Marketplace
Yeah.
module. Nice. Like when Sitecore 9 was actually released, like I heard about the stretch database. Like this is especially for the on-prem databases. Like what it gave is like whenever your database is actually getting expanded, what they can use is they can store, I mean Sitecore will store, or SQL, I don't know like how it will work, but it will store all the older data to SQL, to the Azure blob storage. And Microsoft will not charge for them because those are just stored. They will only charge for the usage only. So that's how like it gave advantage of having less number of records or data on the analytics database. I never used it, but in theory, I just read about that.
Great work, Yogesh.
Yep.
Yeah, great
Thank you.
presentation. Oh, did you say you had a link to that PowerShell warm-up script?
Oh, yes. So that is this one. So I don't know. Maybe I can send it on the chat as well. It's really difficult to get the chat window here. Yeah, I got it.
Super, thank you.
Again, like I have not prepared those PowerShell scripts. Those are I really forgot the community member who actually created that. That was for Sitecore 8 basically. And what we did is we added the identity service identity provider as well. So the login will be happening on that. So let me find out those PowerShell scripts. Yeah, warm up ID with ID. And there should be another PowerShell script. So basically what we do is we will pass the domain name of the CM instance, then domain name of the ID instance, I mean identity server, and the username and password. So what we did is create a low profile username and password with the least access, and the configuration file from where it will read like what to do. So these parameters will be passed from Azure DevOps or whatever tools you are using. So we will call this PowerShell, and let me show you this JSON file. Okay, so these are the login page elements, the HTML elements, those are username and password. So basically we will dump the username and password here and do login. And after that, it will start navigating all these URLs like Sitecore URL, Launchpad, container editor, and so on.
Cool. Yeah, we found this to be a really important thing to do well, especially if you're using deployment slots in Azure, because if you don't do the warm up, sometimes it takes so long for Sitecore to start up that Azure doesn't actually think the application is running. You'll start getting weird 500 errors on your website because it'll assume your site's down just
Yeah.
because it's taking so long to respond.
And sometimes it is hard to judge like it is really a Sitecore issue or it's an infrastructure issue. So yeah, that's a really common problem in Azure.
Yeah, especially if you pair it with like a CDN like Akamai. We've had issues where like the site's been up, everything looks great, but externally they've been seeing 500s for the last hour.
That's horrible. Anybody has like horrible experiences on Sitecore performance? Maybe we can talk about that, like what the problem was and how we fixed it, something like that.
I have one use case actually. One of our client, we recently upgraded to 9 and we are experiencing a lot of performance related issues, part of which is a very heavy traffic due to COVID, of course. And the other reason is that the shard databases of XConnect. So it is currently infrastructure as a service platform, and we are currently doing a brainstorming into resetting the infrastructure onto a higher capacity of the servers. So it's currently in discussion, but the question I have is that I never do a setup of a separate roles for Sitecore 9. And I'm not sure, like for reporting or processing servers, how does the licensing work in particularly? Like, do we need a license for each instances, like for each role? For instance, if we have a content authoring environment and as a separate web server, then another server is a processing and another is a reporting server. Do we need license for all three web servers, or we can separate out the reporting server without Sitecore license and utilizing other two with licenses?
I think I do not have the exact answer, the correct answer, but I think it should be charging for those roles as well. I think so. Or maybe
Uh,
anyone else.
yeah, I have some insight probably I can pass on. Uh, there is a couple of options here. So one of the licensing would be based on your IIS instances. So the number of IIS instances, and it will be also combined with the number of domains that you're allowed to host. Second way of licensing, which is something recently Sitecore is pushing on, is to have licensing based on traffic with a combination of the domains that it can host. So when you're in a traffic based with number of domains, it is pretty much unlimited. You can scale up as you want. Nobody cares how many IIS instances you have. But if you're on the other way around, the number of IIS instance with the domain limitation, then that will be a problem. If you are hosting, reporting, and processing separately, that will be accounted as a separate IIS instance.
Bala, isn't that module, the subscription-based module, is retired now? Like I don't think it's, I mean, just, I could be wrong, but I thought like they canceled that way.
No, actually, recently one of our clients, we were in a IIS and domain based, and we moved into the subscription based model. So subscription is basically based on the traffic. So you can say we'll get like 2 million hits a month, and then overall we'll have so much, some approximate number. That all depends on the analytics data that you provide them. Basically, in our case, we provided some Google Analytics on the traffic, and they said, hey, okay, ballpark is this number. So you have so many domains attached to it, and this is your cost. I believe they are pushing towards that, which is more towards their SaaS model. Like they want to bring that soon. So probably they're starting that right now.
Yeah, I think that, what you are saying, Vala, is right, that the subscription is something that they are heavily marketing on right now, but also it is true that subscription licensing is very expensive as opposed to if you have the normal or the regular Sitecore licensing, and it will be tricky when client does not want to spend that much of a money onto subscription versus they could spend on adding another server.
I
Yeah.
I personally agree with you. I personally was suggesting Sign to just stick with the IIS instance level because that was cheaper and like you can have a number of domains. But later I came to know that even with the limited IIS thing, we still had limitation on the domains. But they were not complaining about the number of reporting or processing you're having, but they were concerned on the number of CD, CM, how much do you have?
Okay.
And even with the subscription model, we were trying to expand our scope into Azure PaaS for a different requirement. So I had the same question, like how does the licensing would work for this? The answer I got is, okay, how many domains you're going to host, then probably we can work something out. Rather having a separate licensing, we can include part of your existing and then add the traffic for that domain. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah.
so that is something new. Lot of people like bit confusing, and it is all customized as per the client needs. And if the client is ready to pay a lot of money, then there might be a custom plan which is expensive.
Yeah, that's true. But thank you. This is really helpful, Bala.
Yeah, which we recently had a conversation around this, and I got some insight on it. So I thought it would be good to share.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
I think if we do not have any other topic, then maybe we can wrap up.
Thank you, Yogesh. Really great insights.
Thank you, Yogesh. Really good.
Yep.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks.
Thank you, Yogesh.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Yep, bye.
Bye-bye.